Okay, this is the intro to the recording for the Friday night Bible study, October 11, 2019, the Friday night, the Sabbath eve, the Sabbath before the Feast of Tabernacles begins this Sunday night. And this recording will go into the archive and we'll be streaming live on Facebook Live Sabbath service page. And we'll begin as soon as we get a green light from Facebook Live, and I'm just going to have to pause because we don't have the music tonight. Let's see, the opening music. I wish we did, but we don't. Here we go. Greetings, brethren. Those of you listening on Facebook or watching, viewing on Facebook Live, happy Sabbath. Welcome to the Friday night Bible study. We're beginning without our music. You see that screen is dark. We'll just come on in tight over here. Hope you had a great week. Hope you're prepared and ready for the Feast of Tabernacles beginning this Sunday evening. There's some of us who've been pre-planning for the feast and having some delightful pre-feast fellowship that Woody and Jeannie and I had today in Birmingham. And now this is the Friday night Sabbath Eve Bible study for the 13th day of the 7th month. And you know, the Feast of Tabernacles begins on God's sacred calendar, on the holy calendar, on the 15th of the 7th month. Tonight and tomorrow, until sunset tomorrow, is the 13th of the 7th month. Tomorrow night at the end of the Sabbath begins the 14th of the 7th month through Sunday at sundown. And at sundown, it becomes the 15th day of the 7th month. And the 15th day of the 7th month, you look in Leviticus 23, you see that is the first day of unleavened bread. That is not only a feast day for the week-long Feast of Tabernacles, but it's the first day of it is a holy day. And then the 8th day of the feast, a separate feast, after the week-long 7 days of Feast of Tabernacles are finished, immediately begins the last great day. So we're off and running for that beginning this Sunday evening. And now some of you may be asking, well, Stephen, why you got that slide of the two goats? The Day of Atonement was, 4 days ago on the 10th day of the 7th month. And I forgot to show this slide on atonement. And because at this time, when the Feast of Tabernacles begins, there'll only be one goat. You know, there's an old saying, let me see. Let's see if we can bring that full forward and we can see it. There's an old saying, it's cutting off part of it on there. But it's up there. Don't let anybody get your goat. Let's see if we can get the whole thing in here like this. And by the way, my apologies to those who are listening or who are hard of hearing. Our closed caption device, Windows took it over and is trying to update everything on that tonight. So where we run the software that runs our closed captions, it's not available tonight. Sorry about that. But there will only be one goat up there when, after Jesus Christ returns 10 days later, takes the one that is a counterfeit of Jesus Christ, the devil, pretending to be Christ. He's going to be gone when this Feast of Tabernacles time begins. This symbolic picturing of Christ's rule on the earth for 1,000 years, called the millennium. The millennium. It's the 7th millennium since the creation of man, but it's called the millennium because it's this millennium when Christ is back here and ruling. All right, what do I have for us tonight? We've got an outstanding sermon by God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, and when he finishes up, I'm going to play one hymn. You'll be welcome, even though it's Bible study. It really relates to the Feast of Tabernacles, a time of great unity, peace on the earth, and you'll see what that hymn is after Mr. Armstrong speaks. He's going to speak tonight on the subject of God's chosen apostles, of which he was one, and the last one of God's apostles, the end-time apostle, meaning he had, and we, brethren, those of us who are truly called and chosen and give and yield ourselves to the spring harvest, we ourselves are the evidence of the apostleship of Herbert W. Armstrong, selected by the Father and Jesus Christ. You know, we are selected by the Father as a good risk for the spring harvest. God carefully considers, well, can I work the numbers on this person to manipulate things around them when they need punishment because they're off track, or to help them learn to do this or that? Will they be listening to the people I'm using, who I inspire to say certain things? And the person speaking may even wonder, why is that in my head so strong and I have to speak it, especially if the man speaking has prayed earnestly with prayer and fasting, that God, when he opens his mouth from the pulpit, as this is as if it were from the pulpit when I go live here, and God responds to that with, boom, thoughts he put in there. You can even affect it. Even while we're on a live stream, you can pray, hey, God, don't let the guy tell a lie. There's a movie like that, you know. Or you can pray, you know, God, there's something I'd like at some point to have you inspire him to say. And God may do that right away. He may wait and do it another time. But you can have effect, especially if a lot of you were praying the same thing. That's why the live stream, when you listen live, is the best way to go, but we do archive the recordings for the convenience of those who, for some reason, not able to get the live stream either right away or from Facebook source. They have to go to YouTube, which we don't put on there till later. We don't live stream it on YouTube. We put an archive copy on YouTube. But Mr. Armstrong is going to be speaking about God's chosen apostles, and since he was one of them, he's going to speak a little bit about his history, and that's good for us to hear and to know and learn some things about, and to keep in mind during this Feast of Tabernacles, which it's a time of great peace. It reflects a time when the devil is put away. That's why I had that slide up there with the two goats picturing Christ and the counterfeit Christ, the devil pretending to be Christ. There's only going to be one goat at the time of this, pictured by this Feast of Tabernacles, starting this Sunday night. One goat, and that goat is, you know, symbolically, that goat from the two goats is Jesus Christ. You know, at the end of the day, on Day of Atonement, that picture we had up there with that two goats, let's back that up for a second. With the two goats, you know, one of them, they're identical, and so they have to cast lots to figure out which one is the Azazel, the escape goat. Not the scapegoat, but the escape goat, the goat that is led away to the wilderness, bound, and then let loose to escape and run around in a bottomless pit, symbolically a wilderness that's away from everybody. It's locked up for 1,000 years. And that's why we have peace. That broadcast of Satan, of hostility, anger, lust, greed, jealousy, etc., cut off. No more being broadcast to the minds of men. And that's a wonderful time. And this time coming up during Feast of Tabernacles, where you go to a place where God puts his name, which today is where God's true ministers are, those who have not compromised God's law. That's where the feast of God is. That's where God puts his name. You got somebody out there who's either deflocked or disfellowshipped, and worse than disfellowship, we were talking about this today, is being defrocked. That means you don't even have the potential of being a minister anymore. You were one once, but you blew it badly for some reason, such that the apostle, when the apostle defrocks one of the men that was under him, you're out, baby. And I don't care how good a speaker you are or how magnificent you sound or what wonderful books and publications you yourself may have created, which a lot of which is just a bunch of bahooey anyway, because in first-year Bible we could buy a Bible, a loose-leaf Bible, where you could move the chapters around and put them in the inspired order. And I did that my first year, and I found out when I was using that Bible, it was a pain in the neck, because we're used to the way the King James Version is laid out, and all the other versions are laid out that way, and it's here a little, there a little. Herman Hay used to be called Dr. Hay, who had a brilliant German mind. He and was trained from early days. He was one of the first students at Ambassador College. He told the students, he said, when it comes to the inspired order of the Bible, the value to it is if you're reading the Bible from the beginning to the end. It's good to read it in the inspired order. So, but you can, as long as you know the inspired order, as you finish one chapter, you just flip to the next book in the inspired order, and there you go, you got it. But otherwise, the layout, the way it is, for our purposes, where we're flipping scriptures here a little, there a little, and one very important scripture, let's see if it's going to come up here, is this one from Luke 21:36. Many of you hear me cite this one often. I'll bring it full screen for a second. The one where Jesus Christ said, "Watch you therefore, and pray always." With always defined in a good Greek English lexicon as without ceasing, praying with all your might, all your soul, all your mind about the people affected by the 4 seals that we're told to watch. This verse is referring to. I'm not going to elaborate on this very long tonight. I want to get to Mr. Armstrong and be short. But the 2 wonderful promises, we should be keeping this in mind even during this feast coming up. Yes, we're going to have some fun, but that should not be our primary goal. We want to be learning. We want to be acting like kings and priests, which we're going to be. We who are called to the spring harvest. Those of us who are accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man, that passage means those who are accounted worthy to be born into the first resurrection. You can blow that. You can blow that even by not doing what Christ said right here in Luke 21:36. Watch and pray always. Oh, that's just if you want to be accounted worthy to escape. I'll just let the beast kill me and boom, I'm in there. Yeah, well, wait till you try to stand up against that beast when they torture you first. You'd be much wiser to do your watching and praying now, even during the feast. And I'll admit, while we haven't been on with World Watch, guess what? Yours truly has let down. One of my buddies told me today that I haven't checked this even yet. We were doing some preparations and things. I put up a note telling you we'd be off World Watch for a while because we're preparing for feast, and maybe things are falling in place for it. And everybody involved knows it's still on a maybe situation. But as things fall in place, I'm saying, well, okay, looks like this might be your answer, that it's a go. I'm not 100% certain yet. There's still one thing I got to work out. I'm going to try to even see if we can resolve that during the Sabbath. I may try a live stream with a device I would have to take with me tomorrow if I can get the information I need for programming a small laptop I can take with me. But brethren, during the feast, we should be acting like kings and priests. And that means acting with dignity. And as you have fun, you don't carry it too far. You don't go to extremes and overboard. That's not the purpose of the feast. In having, in rejoicing. Yes, we rejoice. But there's a difference between rejoicing and just having fun. Rejoicing has an element of dignity to it. And we're rejoicing with a purpose, not just having wild, uncontrolled, undignified fun. We have to keep things respectful. We have to keep things proper, because we're going to be kings and priests reigning and ruling with Jesus Christ, our high priest, the King of Kings. And there's dignity, great dignity involved in that. We want to keep that in mind. And we're all at a time, this would also be a good time for learning things about loving one another, which Jesus Christ, the one thing he said, I leave you as a new commandment, is that you love one another. And I understand we all have some room for learning about that. There's been a very wonderful example of that in a lady in town with us here. I'll give a salute to Jeannie Glenn. And as we learn that, we also can learn there are some caps. The balance would be balance without compromise. But we'll talk about that more later. We're going to come on right back here and go to Mr. Armstrong, who's going to be speaking again about God's chosen apostle. I do want to ask you, please, as Mr. Armstrong speaks, that I'm going to go ahead and put his lower third up here with his name, because we're going to flip over to him in just a second. As he speaks and it tells you about his background while he goes into this, God was choosing him for a position of apostleship, and I would very much like to encourage everybody, as your own personal Bible study, we're going to sign off early tonight, and I'm going to ask you, after we sign off, and you hear this beautiful hymn about, brethren dwelling together in unity, I want to ask you to read Numbers 12, the whole chapter. Let me take a look. Do you want you to read the whole chapter? Yeah, it's not that long. It's only 16 verses long. I want to ask you to read it, and as you read it, brethren, I want to ask you to please substitute God's end-time apostle's name in there where there's Moses. Moses was, what would he be called? Prophet? He was he was above the high priest, who was his brother Aaron. And Numbers 12 clearly shows that when Miriam and Aaron, Moses' sister and brother, spoke against Moses, he brought all three of them to the tabernacle, and he told Miriam and Adam, essentially, he told them to hush your mouths. He said, has the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses, was what they were saying, and God came down and said to them, in the pillar of the cloud, he stood in the door of the tabernacle. He called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And God, said, hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, see, God was referring to Moses as a prophet right here in this verse 6, Numbers 12. If there be a prophet among you, I, the eternal Lord your God, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak to him in a dream. See, God has a very special thing going on with, as he's putting it here, his prophet. And God says, verse 7, my servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him, now God's making a contrast with how he spoke to prophets. So he's not actually referring to Moses as a prophet, because he says, my servant Moses is not so. He's not a prophet, but he's faithful in all mine house. And with him, I have a relationship that's more special than I do with the prophets, who I give visions and dreams. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, face to face, as we say it today. God goes on and says, even apparently, or as the margin says, plainly. Wait a minute. Where's that? I'll speak with him plainly, not in obscure language, not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the eternal Lord God shall he behold the similitude. He doesn't see it direct, but he sees the similitude of God. Wherefore then, now he puts the question right to Miriam and Adam. Wherefore, why in the world then are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and then he departed. And after he departed, Miriam became leprous, white as snow, and Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Okay, now it only says Miriam was made leprous there. God saw that Aaron feared and repented. He could see it on the spot. But Miriam, she's still holding this attitude that needs adjustment. And she had to be put out, she had to have that leprosy left upon her by God for a whole week. And then she was put outside the camp. And the camp of Israel was frozen. They couldn't move and march like they normally would. They had to wait until God took the leprosy off Miriam. He let her have it for a week so she could make herself a little attitude adjustment and see that, as God told him, you don't speak against my servant Moses. As you read this and the rest of the words, every time it says Moses there, I want to ask you to because it applies in principle. This was talking about Moses in the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians 10 tells us, that the things that happened in the Old Covenant were given for us as an admonition today. And in principle, God's apostle would be, he's referenced as a servant, and an apostle is a servant of God. So you can put Mr. Armstrong's name in here in principle, not marking it permanently or changing it in your Bible, but you can make a side note in your margin and put Mr. Armstrong's name in there, Herbert Armstrong, Apostle Herbert, there when you see Moses, and apply it and see if you don't begin to understand. Look, this is God's servant. God, Revelation 1 verse 1 tells us that God the Father reveals things through Jesus Christ his Son, who then reveals it through his servants. And then in Revelation, things are mentioned that were reserved to these latter days. The early apostles did not know the things that God revealed in these latter days through his end time apostle. I'll give you one example. Flip over to Revelation 17 verse 10, where God says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is. And then he says the other is not yet come. So out of the 7, you got 5 that are fallen. You got 1 that is at a certain point in time. So that's 6. And then you got the other is not yet come. That's number 7 of the 7 kings. We know a lot of people knew who the first 5 kings were. And that 1 is really sums up God's end time apostle, because even though that's written in present tense, way back when it would have been future tense when the Apostle John on the Isle of Patmos in 90 A.D. wrote those words that says, and 1 is. There's 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is. Well, he wasn't is at that point in time. The 5 that are fallen hadn't even been born yet. They hadn't come and gone or become fallen. And the 1 is hadn't been born. So he wasn't is yet, but it says 1 is. So that verse is focusing in on the time period of when the 1 is was, which was between 1935 and 1945. To be exact, it was between the fall of 1935 and the springtime of 1945. To be exact, the ending date was April 28, 1945. If you want to check your historical records, you'll see that was when Mussolini was shot in the belly, and then his comrades and his mistress also shot in the belly, and they all were hung upside down from the canopy of a gasoline station in Italy, an Esso station there, and that was revealed through God's end time servant Herbert W. Armstrong. Which there you are. It's a Revelation 1:1. Let's flip there for a second. God says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God, referring to God the Father, gave unto him. So the Father, it says, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's saying that the Father gave it to Jesus Christ to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And God revealed that. That's just one example, Revelation 17:10. Very important example. Because by understanding that Mussolini was the 1 is between Mr. Armstrong's time, his heyday, if you want to put it that way, but don't spell heyday H-O-E-H. That would be a heyday like H-A-Y day. All right, I probably didn't need to give you that one, but anyway, some of you know what I mean when I say hay with a H-O-E-H. But God gave that to us through Mr. Armstrong, who that 6th king was. And that's fulfilling the first verse of chapter 1 of Revelation relates right to the end time apostle. The Father gave it to Christ. Christ gave it to Herbert Armstrong. I know some of you that tune in once in a while, especially enemies of mine, those that love to the dill pickle and others, at least it's kind of, how do you say? It's kind of, I don't know what to say. Interesting that my enemies, they will tune in once in a while. You know, they pick me to tune into and then write these bad things about. But at least they give some listen. So, fine. Say what you want. You can't hurt me. In fact, some of you that have written some bad stuff about me, you've caused people to come check it out. And then they write back on your post, if you don't knock it out too early. I've seen it. They write it in there that say, hey, he ain't as bad as you say he is. And that guy you compared him to, he's a whole lot better than him. You know, I admit, though, when I first started this and I didn't want to do this, I didn't like doing this. I wanted to be back behind the camera with somebody here that, you know, that, like Mr. Collins, who first started this. I liked it that way. I liked it that way very much. And when I had made a commitment before Mr. Collins died that, yeah, I'll keep this going, I didn't think that meant that I helped and assisted him. I thought we'd have somebody else I could help and assist who'd be happy to take this over. It didn't work out that way. And wound up nobody wanted to take it. I had to take it. And to those of you who tune in, Walter, greetings to you up in Canada. Got your note today. Glad you're here with us tonight. Was waiting for it to come on and look for it. I went ahead and signed us on to get us as close to start time as I could, even though some of our equipment would not fire up tonight, so I wasn't able to play the Big Seal and the music we usually play that runs for almost a minute, which gives time for people who get a notice to click on the thing and get tuned in with us so you hear us from the beginning when we're live. I wasn't able to do that tonight, but greetings to you, Walter Little in Canada. Thanks for your note saying you were looking forward to it. That actually encouraged me. I was tired. I was going to just pack it in early tonight. But I saw your note. Well, actually, I had already decided, no, I better be there. And then I saw your note. That really encouraged me. Don't close it down. Stay with it, Steve. Go ahead and do it. And then I found this telecast, which is of a sermon excerpt from Mr. Armstrong speaking in 1978 that really gives us things we should be thinking about during the feast and remembering, even though he died and even though it's Feast of Tabernacles. You know, you can go and have whatever your heart lusts after in the way of food to eat and things, you know, things like that, and do some fun things, yes, but as you do them, keep in mind that scripture from Luke 21:36, and today I was about to say it and I didn't finish here. Woody told me about a news story, I hadn't checked it out and seen it yet, that has been on the back of my mind all day long, and I'm thinking, wow, what's going on with Iran shooting a missile at some oil tanker in the Middle East? I got to check that out. I haven't. I'll try to do that more tonight. Maybe I can comment on that in the live stream in the morning. We should, even during the feast, we should keep aware of these things. And, you know, last year during the feast, I kept the news program going. I was right here. I didn't go anywhere. I kept the news program going at night and we streamed sermons during the day. And this year, if I go off to a remote location and carry some equipment with me, that will work. We'll at least be doing the Feast of Tabernacles sermons that I provide to you from here on this channel. And I'll be keeping my eye on the news because we should do that. I don't know if we'll do the World Watch during the feast from a remote location. I don't know if that'll work very well, but I'll at least be watching it, and I'll make mention during the sermons during the week if there's anything, you know, pertinent, and I'll try to mention the pertinent things so you can continue every day, even during the feast, keeping your eye on the news. And John Bryan, thank you for that earthquake notice you gave me. And yeah, those things continue to have over 100 earthquakes of 1.5 magnitude or greater every day. Brethren, if you don't think that fifth seal could open up at any time, you're not really paying attention to the news. You're not doing what Jesus Christ instructed us to do, because those seals are blossoming already. If the Father decides that this is it, it's like the time when he decided, Noah, get on the boat, close the door. God sealed up the door. The rain started coming down. That was it. The door was sealed. And when that happens with the fifth seal opening up, after the four seals blossom, the Great Tribulation begins. That's the curtain. At that moment in time, the woman of Revelation 12:14, which in prophecy a woman is the church, and in the entirety of chapter 12 of Revelation, the woman there is the true church being spoken of. And if you start in verse 14, it refers to the church, the true church, the portion of the church who are represented right here in this verse, Luke 21:36, those who are accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, beginning with the fifth seal. They are flown, verse 14 of Revelation 12, on two wings of a great eagle, except John Bryan, he's going to be flown on a real eagle, not a symbol. No, I'm just joking about that. It's probably just going to be me. No, I don't know. You know, I joke about that so much, God may say, okay, Stephen, here's one on you. You don't get on that plane. You stand by. I got something swooping down with big claws opening. Yeah. Anyway, I'm crazy enough to enjoy that. I could talk about fun. I could actually enjoy that. Woo-hoo! Just don't drop me. And it fly us all to the Middle East, those who are counted worthy to escape. Then verses 15 and 16 kick in. And I would encourage you, beside reading Numbers 12 tonight, the entire chapter after we sign off, I'm trying to wrap up here and play Mr. Armstrong. We'll sign off just a little over an hour, not the whole 90 minutes tonight. Leave you time that you would normally have been watching the Bible study here tonight to read all of Numbers 12. It's only 16 verses. Shouldn't take you more than 15 minutes if you spent 1 minute each reading each verse. You really, most of you can probably read Numbers 12, the entire chapter, in maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes or so. And 10 if you're a slow reader, 15 if you're a really slow reader. And then read the 4 verses from Revelation 12 through 17. That would be Revelation 12:14, 12, 15, 12, 16, 12, 17, those 4 verses. 15 and 16 tell you that those who've been accounted worthy to escape, they're not flown right into the place of safety by the two wings of a great eagle. And if it is modern jet aircraft, they got to go to a big airport. Jordan doesn't have any of those big airports directly in there that we can be flown in. And, well, Amman, there's one up there, okay, but you're going to be flown where you can go view Jerusalem, to see when an army surrounds Jerusalem. And then in Matthew 12 and in Luke 21, Christ tells you when that happens, when an army surrounds Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. And the perspective is from Jerusalem. So when you flee from Jerusalem, the mountains are northeast. I'm sorry, no, they're not. They're southeast. Yeah, across the Jordan River, which is to the east of Jerusalem, and east and south is those mountains. Those mountains are the mountains of Petra. They're in the southern suburb of Edom. Edom is south of Moab in the middle, and Moab is south of Amman, presently the capital of Jordan, at the north end of Jordan, over on the east side of the Jordan River. That is the area described by Daniel in chapter 11, verse 41. The only verse in the Bible that tells you land that is protected from the beast during the Great Tribulation. The beast has no reach into that land. God is protecting that. That is the place where those accounted worthy to escape go. And there's a big rock-walled entranceway at Petra to Edom. And that reminded God's end-time apostle, Herbert Armstrong, it reminded him of the gelled-up walls of the Red Sea when ancient Israel chased. I'm just saying it backwards. Ancient Israel didn't chase anybody. They were chased by Pharaoh's army through the Red Sea. Well, those accounted worthy to escape are going to be chased by the devil's army. You'll read that in verses 15 and 16 of Revelation 12. And then God says in verse 16 that he opens up the earth and swallows Satan's army. And probably as he does that and opens up the earth and shakes those rocks, they all fall in, form a big pile that seals off the entranceway through what was those Petra walls. It'll be all sealed off. People can no longer access this land that is now, in prophecy, It's not now protected land by God, but it becomes that after Revelation 12:16 in time chronology kicks in, comes about. And then, verse 17. Be sure to read verse 17 of Revelation 12, because that tells you what happens to those who didn't get in there, who weren't accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass. And they're part of the woman, part of the true church. They keep the commandments of God, verse 17 says. They have the testimony of Jesus Christ. They understand Christ is returning to usher in and restore God's kingdom. And it calls them a remnant. So when you've got those accounted worthy to escape, but you've got a remnant that wasn't accounted worthy to escape, it's like a remainder. When you divide something, you've got the remainder. They don't get to go in there, but they were keeping the commandments, but they weren't doing these two prerequisites by which God says this is part of how you get accounted worthy to escape, which precedes the 3.5 years later, you're being accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection. If you're not accounted worthy to escape, you're not accounted worthy of the first resurrection either. And that means you're being left behind. And Revelation 3, verse 18 tells you the only way that you are going to be able to get in God's kingdom if you're part of the remainder that's left behind. And it explains you're going to have to give your life in martyrdom. I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fiery trial of martyrdom. That's the time setting for the Laodicean era. All these vanity plate, blankety-blank Church of God groups that are teaching, oh, the Laodicean era is here now. Well, they're just trying to justify themselves having a banana-peeling adjective put in front of Church of God as a separate business formation, whether it be corporate or association or LLC or whatever, DBA, whatever. They're trying to justify their existence. And they've divided the body of Christ, and God says he hates division. He says, mark those that cause division. So those who have created these blankety-blank, this and that Church of God groups, they should be marked. And that's what God says for causing division. So take those names off those things. You can serve people if you want to serve people. Take the names off of there. Mr. Armstrong had us not even call ourselves members of the Worldwide Church of God, or prior to that to the Radio Church of God. And he said, don't even be saying you're members of the Armstrong movement. But he did want us to recognize, and you're going to hear that in this sermon, he wanted to recognize that God called him to be an end-time apostle and to respect the authority that he had. And God did it in a way that he trained him for 50 years. And in those last 6 years, even the last 6 months especially, we really got some gold mine gems. Let's go to him. Come back, we'll sing a hymn, and we'll close up, and then you can read those chapters and verses that I recommended to you. From 1978, God's end-time apostle speaking on God's chosen apostles, the end-time apostle, Herbert.
That God created with angels. And I have shown you, and this is so important, I want to repeat it again. I want to repeat this as Franklin D. Roosevelt would have said, again and again and again, because I want you to really get it. The one thing that God Almighty cannot create direct and by fiat is perfect, spiritual, and holy character. That is something that must be developed. That is why we're on earth. But first, God and the Word created angels. Then they created the physical universe that is described in Genesis 1, verse 1, the very first verse in all the Bible. And at that time, however, as you read in the 38th chapter of Job, the angels were already here, and they shouted for joy at the creation of this earth, because it was to be their home, their habitation. Before Adam, before the first human being ever appeared on this earth, suddenly created as a whole mature man and did not come up by a process of evolution, there were angels who inhabited this earth. I read to you in 2 Peter of how the angels sinned. In other words, they rebelled against the law of God. God put his government over them. Now, the government of God ruled the entire earth at that time. And God placed a super archangel to rule. His name was Lucifer. Lucifer was the highest creation of angel that God himself could create. He was a super archangel. However, God could only instruct him in the right way, but he had to leave the choice to him, because otherwise there could be no character. And Lucifer chose the wrong way, and he led his angel into a rebellion, and the government of God was taken away from this earth, and that left only God, who had the type of character that would not, and because he would not, could not commit sin and go the wrong way. Now, sin is the transgression of that law that is the basis of the government of God, and it is a way of life. It is the way of love, of outgoing concern to want to help everybody else, the way of cooperation, the way of giving instead of getting. Now, this Lucifer turned to the way that we now call human nature, and it came from him and not from God, and it is the way of vanity, to exalt your own self and debase others, to try to mount up above others. I remember so well a motion picture. I think it came very shortly after World War II. And it was a picture of Hitler and Mussolini. Who took those parts? I think Charlie Chaplin took the part of Hitler. And Oki, what was his name? He took the part of Mussolini. And anyhow, here was Hitler and Mussolini, and one of them was visiting the other. I don't know whether they were in Berlin or down in Rome. But anyhow, they had the private barber shop of the Führer, or the Italian leader, and it was a two-chair barber shop. That reminds me, really, of the one in Ambassador College at Pasadena. The men's barber shop is a two-chair shop, and which I have used many, many times. Well, anyway, in this thing, Mussolini reached down on the lever and jacked it up to lift him about half an inch higher. And Hitler saw it, and he took and jacked his up 2 times to make him a little higher than Mussolini. And then Mussolini jacked himself up a little higher, and then Hitler a little higher, and they kept on till they both hit the ceiling on top. Now that was laughable, but it shows you that little quirk of human nature, of everyone wanting to make himself a little higher than everybody else. And that, as I say, I haven't time to explain too much of that in this program, but that really has come from Satan, who is called in the Bible the prince of the power of the air. Now, we get through the air, and I know that probably every one of you in this country have a television set or two at home, and you tune in, and there it comes, the picture and the sound and the voices, the music, the whatever, and it's just coming through the air. You may have an inside aerial just above your set, or you may have one up on the roof. But let me tell you, in this room where we are right now, there are many voices. Only your ears can't pick them up because they're not tuned to the right wavelength. And you don't hear them. But you bring radio sets in here and turn them into a number of different radio stations and get them on the right wavelength, and you can boost up the sound, and you'll find that you have a great conglomeration of singing, of speaking, and of every kind of noise. It's in the air, but we're not hearing it. Now, it's marvelous the things that we can send through the air today. Do you ever stop to think about that? We have come to the time, most of the inventions and the things we have come in my lifetime. I tell you, back when I was a little boy, we were still in the horse and buggy days. We had just gotten rid of the horse-drawn streetcars and had the first little, what we call little dinky trolley cars in Des Moines, Iowa, where I was born and reared. And I remember when the first automobiles came, we called them horseless carriages. And that was quite a sight. And if an automobile came past the house, everybody would run to the window to see it. Now, we often call them horseless carriages because some of them, they just took carriages and put a motor in it, and they put a stick to turn one. It wasn't a wheel to steer it, but a stick that would turn one way or the other. And I suppose most of you are not old enough to remember having seen one of those. But they called them horseless carriages because they had just taken a regular carriage and put a motor in it, and it was running. Well, one day when I was 11 years old, I remember my father said, "Hey, everybody, come quick. Here's a horseless carriage going by." And the whole family came running up to the front window, and sure enough, there was a horseless carriage. It was a carriage drawn by a mule. And my father had a great laugh.
Herbert W. Armstrong will return right after this message.
The human mind differs from an animal brain. An animal just looks with dull eyes, and he's not thinking because he doesn't have thinking capacity. But he has a brain just exactly and precisely like a human brain. Now, they have taken apart the brains of whales, of elephants. They're all a little bit larger than human brains, and then of a chimpanzee, which is just slightly smaller, but all of them are exactly alike. And the human brain is not even probably 5% superior physically and in the physical brain itself. Why then do we have the ability to think and to think creatively, to reason and to make decisions? I'll tell you why. First, it's because God knew that He wanted to develop character within us, and in order to do that, He put a spirit within every human being. Now, that spirit is not a person. It is not an immortal soul. It is merely spirit essence, just like a handful of air. You remember Solomon had tried everything and every pleasure in the world. He built great projects for his nation, and he wanted to see what life was like, and he finally ended up saying that everything was vanity. He said it was like grabbing a handful of air. What have you got? Nothing. And it's time that many of us learned that lesson. Solomon learned it a long, long time ago. But the spirit in every one of us is just like so much air. It is not a person. It cannot think, it cannot see, it cannot hear. Your physical brain sees through the eye. Your physical brain hears through the physical ear. And it is your physical brain that does the thinking, but the spirit in every one of us transmits the power of intellect to that physical brain. Now, where does Satan come from? This Lucifer that was set as a super archangel over the angels of this earth before man was put here was said to be, and I read that scripture in the first one of the present series of programs, that he was perfect in all his ways from the day he was created. He was not born. He was a specially created being, and he was perfect in his ways as God created him. But it says, till iniquity was found in him. Now, God had told the angels the right way. He started this Lucifer out on the right track, but he turned he turned his angels into rebellion against God instead of going the way of God. In other words, God's great law, the foundation of his government, was the way of love, the way of giving, the way of cooperating, away from self, not incoming, but outgoing, and the way of helping, of concern for the welfare of others, and not just for yourself alone. The way of humility instead of vanity. God had a great job he wanted those angels to do, but they sort of flunked out in the test. And they disqualified themselves to go on. The job he had is a job that now is the potential of human beings, and the great potential that is ahead of us now, and that is that we are to go to the planets all over this vast universe and complete their creation and turn them from decay, which has come as a result of the sin of those angels and the sins of men, and turn them into production and into beauty, turn darkness and ugliness into beauty. God is the author of beauty. Satan was the author of ugliness. Now, this Lucifer, that was the super archangel, God changed his name to Satan the devil. Satan means Lucifer. Let me tell you first what his name Lucifer meant. Cherub, or shining star of the dawn. It meant he was a bringer of light and truth. But Satan is just the opposite. It is a rival, an adversary, or an enemy. And that is the meaning of the word Satan, the devil. Now, this Lucifer became Satan. He is an immortal being. And his angels became demons. And they get into people. I have cast a few of them out of people when they were in, and freed those people from that thing, because a demon can get into people and take control of their minds. Now, don't get alarmed, because a demon cannot get into you unless you completely lose your head in a rage of anger until you've lost all control yourself, or else you are seeking a spirit like some people that instead of seeking the Holy Spirit of God, they just want to seek, as they call it, the Spirit, and they agonize and everything to let any old spirit come into them, and that's what it does. A demon finally can. Now, I don't know of any other way a demon can get into you, so you don't need to worry, because if you don't do one of those things, no demon can get into you. But demons do get into people. Now, in the 6th chapter of Genesis, God saw that, and this is about 1900 years later, almost 2000, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were evil continually. Now God called Noah. Noah wasn't seeking God, but Noah was a man who wanted to be righteous. He was the only man that was pure in his generations by birth. So God now called him out of the world and says, Noah, I've got a job for you to do. I want you to build a great ship, and it's called an ark in the Bible. And he said, I'm going to bring a flood on this earth. And this ship will save you and your entire family. Because of you, your family will be saved out of it. Otherwise, no flesh would have been saved alive even then. Noah did obey God and built the ship. He must have, I imagine that the people all around him must have jeered and mocked him and ridiculed him. Well, look at the great crazy fool, building a ship right out here on dry land. There isn't any ocean here. There isn't any water. How's he going to get this over to the water? Well, the water came and drowned them. Now, the next case we have of where God intervened in the world to call some for himself out of Satan's world is in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis. Now, the Eternal had said unto Abram, or Abram, if you prefer to call it that, get thee out of thy country. He was living in the country of all the bright lights of that day, the gaiety and the pleasures of Babylon. And God says, you get out of here and come out. And really, disciples today are the come out ones, the ones that come out of this world. Get thee out of thy country and of thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land I will show thee. Now, there were none of that kind of pleasures over in this land where he was to go. Well, it just says, and Abram went. There was no argument. In so many cases, when God had something for a man to do, he wanted to argue and he didn't do it. But Abram did not. It's all about the only case, I guess, in the Bible like that, where he just agreed to do what God had called him to do at the time without quibbling about it one way or the other. Consequently, that was the first example we have of God calling someone out of the world with a mission to perform. Now, next, we come to the case of Moses, which is about 430 years after Abraham, in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. He had married one of Jethro's daughters, the priest of Midian. So he was walking along, going to Horeb, and the angel of the Eternal appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Here was a little bush burning. Well, he saw it quite a ways off before he arrived there, and then he walked right on past it, and he'd walked some distance past and looked back, and the little bush was still burning. Well, he said, why didn't it burn up? He said, a bush like that couldn't have burned this long. So he turned back to see why the bush was burning, and God spoke to him. Well, God said, take your shoes from off your feet, because the ground where you stand is holy ground. Now then, here's the point I want to get over. God was calling Moses for a great commission that he had for Moses to perform. And right away Moses said, well, but Lord, I can't do it. You see, I have an impediment of speech. I stutter. God said, I know that, and I have provided for that. I have provided to have your brother go along with you, and he will be your spokesman, and he will speak for you. Now, you can stutter yourself out until he understands, and then he will speak to the people for you. There were 600,000 men, not counting women and children. So if you add another 600,000 women, that's 1,200,000. Now, adding the children, and there were not less than 3 or 4 million of those Israelites. Now, that is a lot of people. And Moses led them out. Of course, God performed miracles at the Red Sea and all of that, but God led them out. And they came finally to Mount Sinai. There God himself gave them the 10 Commandments, and they all heard the voice of God. They did not get the 10 Commandments from Moses. The people got the 10 Commandments direct from God. Moses was standing there with them at the time. However, God, through Moses, made a proposition. He said, I want to call you to be my people, my special nation. And he said, I'll tell you what I will do. If you obey my word, if you will obey my laws, I'll make you the greatest nation on earth. You will be the wealthiest. I'll give you peace in the land. And if enemies come against you, 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 you will chase 1,000. You will conquer any other nation if they try to come against you, but you will have peace and you will have crops the year around. You will become the wealthiest nation on earth. You will have the greatest blessings of any nation. But listen, brethren, listen. God did not promise them spiritual salvation. Not at all. That was only to Moses, later to the various prophets. Well, now I want you to notice that the rest of the world all this time didn't know anything about God. They went out and formed their own governments, and their own governments, they got into wars one against the other, because they weren't trying to give, they weren't trying to cooperate and help. They were trying to get from the other nation. They were getting into quarrels and disputes, and they would invade in order to take away from the other.
Herbert W. Armstrong will return right after this message.
Warn Nineveh of a destruction that he was going to send to them, but if they would heed the warning, it wouldn't come. But Jonah tried to run away. He didn't want to do it. Notice that usually the men God calls don't want to do it. They want to run the other way. And this Jonah tried to run away in a ship. And he got on a ship. And God had him thrown overboard, and God had prepared a great fish to swallow him up. The Bible does not say a whale, but God prepared a great fish. Probably never has been a fish like that before or since. Anyway, it swallowed him up. And it was like being in the belly of the grave. And anyway, finally, Jonah there agreed he would do what God said, and so it was a type of the resurrection of Christ after 3 days and 3 nights. And he was vomited up, and then he did go, and he delivered that warning, and the city of Nineveh was saved. Now, after Jonah and also after Moses, we come on down to the time when the children of Israel were governed through their prophets that God had called. Next came Joshua, and after that were the different so-called judges or heroes or ones that God called to deliver Israel at different times. And then we came to Eli the prophet, and Samuel was reared under him, and God rejected Eli because he allowed his sons to go contrary to God, and he didn't correct them. Now we come down to the time of Samuel. Samuel had the Spirit of God. Samuel, though, was the one God was using to rule this people that he had called out of the world and separate from the world. Now you come to the 8th chapter of Samuel, and beginning with verse 4. Then the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and they came to Samuel unto Ramah. And they said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all of the nations. In other words, they wanted to become more secular. They wanted to get away from God's ways, and they wanted to be like the world, like Satan's world outside. And people are always like that. They're getting that way today. But the thing displeased Samuel. He went to God, and the Eternal said to Samuel, Well, you listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, God, that God should not reign over them. The people didn't want God to rule them. Now, their forefathers, back in the days of Moses, had agreed to obey God. Now, it's been that way all the way through. We come on to some of the prophets even. There was Isaiah, and he said, Oh, Lord, I can't do what you want me to do because I'm a man of unclean lips. God had the coal off the altar brought on a pair of tongs to cleanse his lips, and God says, Now, who am I going to send? And finally Isaiah said, Well, then send me, here I am. God spoke to Jeremiah and said, I'm calling you out. I'm giving you a special call, and I want you to go before kings and people. And he said, Oh, but Lord, I can't do it. Well, I'm just a youth, and I'm not old enough. I can't do it. I'd be afraid of their stern faces. And God says, Don't fear their faces. I will be with you, and you will do what I tell you. And he did. Now, it has been that way all the way along. Now, I'm going to leave you with that. I've shown you that those that God calls, that he once tried to get away and run the way like Jonah. They didn't want to accept it. And I didn't. I'll tell you, after I had been converted, it took them about 2.5 or 3 years of other people, several of them pleading with me to preach. And I wouldn't do it for 2.5 or 3 years before I finally found something that I just knew the people ought to hear. And I wanted them to hear it so badly that I finally gave in for the first time I spoke before them. And my wife at that time didn't call that a real sermon, but I had something to say. I will say that. I had something to say. And they thought they had heard a good sermon, even though the delivery wasn't much like a sermon. Well, I say goodbye now. This is Herbert W. Armstrong saying goodbye until the next time.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Armstrong, and thank you for brethren who are listening tonight to the Bible study. I told you we'd close up tonight with a little early, and we would close with a hymn. We're going to do one that, but I also want to make a mention here. I'm going to put that goat slide back up for just a minute from 4 days ago when we had the Feast of Atonement, Day of Atonement. On that day, some of you may know a fellow here who's been helping me, came down from New Jersey, Jameson Woody, had his baptism. He was baptized into the body of Jesus Christ on this day of at one man, Atonement, 4 days ago. And if you know Woody, or if you don't know Woody, he's part of the body of Christ now. He's a good man to get to know. And very ebullient, enthusiastic, loving man who God has brought into the body he is building, fitly framing, the building he's fitly framing for Jesus Christ, a spiritual temple. And again, he was baptized just 4 days ago, Day of Atonement. And if you know Woody, or you're connected to him, and you didn't realize that had happened, it has happened, you might want to give him a salute, a greeting, a hello, congratulations, welcome to the body of Christ. I think Woody would probably enjoy hearing that from some of his friends, some of you who know him, and those of you who are in the body of Christ would like to get to know Woody. That'd be a good and great thing. Woody helps me out here a lot, and maybe helping me do the correspondence course for you. We'll read the questions, read the answers during the Feast of Tabernacles as we travel to a secret location somewhere in the state of Florida. All right, let's see. We're not going to play the sermon again. We're going to sing. If you want to sing along, that's fine. I'm going to show you. I'm going to scroll on the screen a hymn from Psalm 133, written by Ross Judson. Let's see. Do I have that working? Bring that slide forward. I need this shot way down here. I think I need this one. Yeah, that should work. Get the lower third out of the way. From Psalm 133, written again by Ross Judson, accompanied by the Ambassador Chorale. How good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. As we're keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, we certainly want to be doing this. And you'll see a goat in the background, since we just had Day of Atonement, along with my donkey here, as the text of the scrolls on the screen. How good and how pleasant. How good and how pleasant for brethren to dwell together in unity. So David did tell, like beautiful music, a breathtaking view, like most precious ointment, like fresh morning dew that descended on the mountains of Zion long before. God commanded a blessing of life forevermore. How good and how pleasant for brethren to be, dwelling safely together in sweet harmony. Now Jesus was praying with fervent desire that all who believe might be one. With voices united, together we stand at peace like the Father and Son. How good and how pleasant for brethren to dwell together in unity. So David did tell, like beautiful music, a breathtaking view, like most precious ointment, like fresh morning dew. Some of you know my donkey Bucky. There she is, right there. Couple goats behind her. She's protecting them. Everybody, verse 3. Let's close it up. One body, one spirit, one Lord and one faith, one God and one Father of all. One baptism into the family of God. Welcome. Welcome, Woody. How good and how pleasant for brethren to dwell together in unity. So David did tell, like beautiful music, a breathtaking view, like most precious ointment, like fresh morning dew that descended on the mountains of Zion long ago. He made it a blessing of life forevermore. How good and how pleasant, brethren, to be together in sweet harmony, traveling safely together in sweet harmony. All right, brethren, thank you for those of you who sang along or just enjoyed it tonight. And that's it for our Bible study for this, well, let's see, let's put the lower third up here on the screen for this 11th day of October 29th. On the Roman calendar, it's the 13th. On the Hebrew calendar, it's the 13th day of the 7th month. And again, just 2 days away from the Feast of Tabernacles. All right, we're going to wrap it up tonight. Thanks for joining us. Remember, I give you a request to read all of Numbers 12, Revelation 12, verses 14 through 17. And we got that other computer finally updated, and it's online now, so we can close out with our closing out music. Everybody have a wonderful regular Sabbath tonight, and in the morning we'll be back here at 9:30 Central Time for the morning service, AM to the U.S., PM to the U.K., right here on cogtv.org. Shabbat Shalom. Good night, everybody. Pleasant Sabbath sleep.